Welcome and good afternoon. My name is Sonya Donaldson, and I am the director of the Hagan Africana Studies Center. I'm the interim director, as well as the coordinator of the African and African American Studies program, and a professor of English at New Jersey City University. And I'm glad that the NJCU community has come together to make this program possible. So thank you first to the following, and it's a long list, so bear with me. The Black Ecologies Working Group, the Office of the Provost, the Student Environmental Club, the Black Alumni, Administrators, Faculty, Student, and Staff Organization, also known as BASO, the Office of Global Initiatives, the Center for Leadership and Engagement, the African and African American Studies Program, the English Department, Student Events and Publications Committee, and Gothic Media. I want to say a special thanks as well to Dr. Sue Henderson, who is here and will be offering some remarks shortly. So I'm happy that JT Roane has agreed to share and to help us create space for this event, which honors the life and work of Dr. Lee Hagan, for whom the center is named. We created the annual lecture to recognize Dr. Hagan's significant role as a scholar activist, his love for Black people, his unyielding energy and drive in the service of Black lives and Black futures. And while I did not know Dr. Hagan personally as he transitioned to be with the ancestors in 1986, I recognize that our charge and our responsibility is to continue this work that began before a center even existed. So this year's theme of race and environmental justice resonates in this moment. But I have to admit, I'm struggling today to come up with words, with language, to name the thing that is not a moment in this country's history, but the unrelenting wake of white supremacist violence, quotidian terror. So our hearts grow heavier with grief and rage at each new alert of another Black life taken by police. In the midst of the trial of Derek Chauvin for the murder of George Floyd, this time it is Dante Wright, who was just 20 years old. And I have no answers, but I'd like to pose a question that Christina Sharp asks, and she says, in the midst of so much death and the fact of Black life as proximate to death, how do we attend to physical, social, and figurative death, and also to the largeness that is Black life insisted from death? So we're here today to engage with Dr. Roane and to consider, to collaborate, to plot our way towards and through an urban future. And I'd like to take this opportunity really just to say, again, thank you to Dr. Henderson for coming to this program today and to participating in something that is quite meaningful to the community. So by way of introduction, welcome, Dr. Henderson.
Sonya, thank you so much. And I want to thank you so much for your words. They were very important. And we need to continue to work on that. I thought just last year of the work that we do in criminal justice and the work that they do at John Jay. And it's exactly, Sonya, what you were talking about and how we have got to solve this problem. So, but thank you for bringing that up. So I'll go to my written remarks, and I'm really delighted you're here. And I will tell you that although I can't be on this one because I'm moderating a national conference for haiku, which is fine. The work that JT Roane is doing is something that has been a lot of interest to me personally, because as you travel around the world, you find that people of color and people who are economically disadvantaged typically end up in the parts of the countries where climate change is going to affect them the most. And I really hope this is something that we as a country get ahead of before it becomes a huge problem. So, but thank you for bringing it up. It also reminds me of the work we're having to do on our West Campus, which, as you know, at one time was a chromium site, but it has been cleaned up. So anyway, which I'm happy. So let me do my remarks. Good afternoon. My name's Sue Henderson. I'm the president of New Jersey City University, and I'm really delighted to welcome you today to this important discussion on plotting urban futures. I welcome Dr. JT Roane virtually to our NGD community today and hope you'll come on campus as soon as you can. Thank you for imparting your knowledge to us as we continue to have important conversations. I especially want to thank Dr. Sonya Donaldson for her leadership in organizing this critical annual lecture and for her leadership over the last year in leading our Lee Hagan Africana Studies Center, whose mission is to promote academic excellence, cultural knowledge, and social responsibility. I am also grateful to the Office of the Provost, BAFSO, and our other organizations and committees on campus who continue to support this annual lecture. While I never had the pleasure to work with Dr. Hagan, it was clear that he left a lasting legacy at our university and in our community, and that his dedication to higher education and a meaningful community service lives on 35 years after his passing. We faced many challenges over the last year, and while the impact of the pandemic on our everyday lives has been paramount among them, the nation's long and overdue awakening to systemic racism has been vital to our futures. This year has been vividly demonstrated that much remains to be done, including come to terms with truce. Today's conversation touches on a narrative that has not been widely circulated in our national discussion, the theme of race and environmental justice. I am pleased that the Student Environmental Club is a co-sponsor of today's event and is working alongside NJCU's Black Ecologies Working Group. Findings have demonstrated that environmental concerns have disproportionately impacted Americans that are located in communities of color. That is why having open, educated, and informed conversations like our lecture today are so important. NJCU has done much on our campus to be a healthier place to live, learn, and work. It is our responsibility as an anchor institution in Jersey City, Hudson County, and our region to lead by example, and we're committed to partnering with our communities on being an agent of change. As Oprah Winfrey once said, turn your wounds into wisdom. Today's conversation is just the beginning. Again, thank you all so much.
Thank you, Dr. Henderson, for those wonderful remarks, and we certainly look forward to plotting the future at NJCU. And now I'd like to introduce our guest, our honored guest, Dr. JT Roane. He is an assistant professor of African and African American Studies in the School of Social Transformation at Arizona State University. He received his PhD in history from Columbia University, and he is a 2008 graduate of the Carter G. Woodson Institute at the University of Virginia. He currently serves as co-senior editor of Black Perspectives, the digital platform of the African American Intellectual History Society, AAIHS. His scholarly essays have appeared in Soul's Journal, the Review of Black Political Economy, and Current Research in Digital History. His work has also appeared in venues such as the Brooklyn Rail, Pacific Standard, The Imminent Frame, and Martyrs Shuffle. Dr. Roane is a 2020-2021 National Endowment for the Humanities Mellon Foundation Research Fellow at the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture in New York. So please join me in welcoming to NJCU Dr. JT Roane, who I know it's a little paternalistic probably to say that I'm incredibly proud of Dr. Roane, and I'm very happy to say Dr. Roane every single time. Welcome to NJCU, JT.
Thank you so much, Dr. Donaldson and Dr. Hagan, for your wonderful introductions. Just a quick edit. Sorry, I forgot to mention this in the previous thing. I'm no longer the co-senior editor of Black Perspectives. I'm running a Black Ecologies initiative out of Arizona State's Institute for Humanities Research. I just want to make sure Tyler Perry is credited for his current work, his labor of love. But so thank you all. And I'm really honored, Dr. Donaldson, to be again in conversation with you. As I said before at the workshop earlier, you are a primary reason and a motivation to go to pursue graduate education in the first place. while I was an undergraduate, you were, and some of the other graduate students and the pre-docs and the postdocs at the Woodson really, made that a horizon of possibility, and did it so well, lovingly and also critically. So I appreciate you, and I wouldn't, be in this role without that. I want to talk to you all today. I originally had a couple of other talks in mind, drawn on a larger book project, Dark Agora's Black Insurgent Social Life and the Politics of Place in Philadelphia. But apropos of everything that's going on in terms of policing and violence, I actually shifted back to thinking about the 1964 riot. I want to think about that as a kind of Black ecology and what we might think about it and how we might think about it as in relation to ecologies. And so I'll just jump in. I want to share a screen. Here we go. And we'll, bear with me. We're on a journey in time. Let me make sure I can read my own script here. Sorry, I'm still figuring. Y'all can see the head slide, right? With Odessa Bradford. Okay, just want to make sure. Sorry. Okay. No, that's not it either. Give me 1 second. I have too many files open. Okay. Now you can't see it. Give me a second. The struggle.
So we can see your presentation,
You can see it. Okay.
but we're not seeing it in presentation form.
Oh, okay.
Yet.
I think if you go to slideshow at the top,
Okay.
that will help you put it in presentation. There you go.
Okay, but see, the problem is when I need to go to my script. So y'all just have to see the back, and we'll get to it. Sorry. Okay, so again, for those of you who were in the workshop, you'll know that one of my starting points and touchstones for thinking about the mid 20th century and the 20th century Black urban communities is June Jordan's kind of rewriting of the 1964 riot as an expression of what she calls the teenage multitude or the multitude. So I'm really interested in what that kind of formulation might tell us about urban futures. And I want to, and the 1964 riot in August in Philly is just after the 1964 riot in Harlem. So just after 9:30 on a temperate late August evening, 2 police officers patrolling near the intersection of 22nd and Columbia Streets in North Philadelphia found the street obstructed by Odessa and Rush Bradford's car. The couple was embroiled in a heated domestic dispute. Despite officers' command for the police to move the car, Odessa, from here on Bradford, refused to remove her foot from the brake, preventing her husband from driving the car away from the intersection. Her refusal in the face of police commands registered to the officers as obstinacy. And while she sought to resolve the matter with her husband then and there, the officers viewed her as simply obstructing the flow of traffic. In response, the officers attempted to forcibly drag her from her car, to which she responded with resistance, quote, shouting and striking at the officers and landing blows to them in their faces and bodies. As the raucousness of the unfolding arrest attracted a crowd, at least one man, 41-year-old, darkened out, and I'll explain that in a second, who investigators later described as an intoxicated reveler in Columbia Avenue's tap rooms, also held in the period to be the center of the city's Black underground, attempted to intervene and block police from arresting Bradford, arguing and fighting with the officers alongside her. Although Bradford, and I'll now want to explain why I didn't mention that person's name and why in the larger work I darken out folks' names. Although Bradford later gave an interview with the Philadelphia Tribune, and you could see the image from that headed that article, which, and of course the Philadelphia Tribune is a African-American newspaper in North Philly, in which she was able to partially speak for herself and was pictured. The majority of those involved in the aftermath of her arrest were given no such opportunity. When she appeared there, it was defiantly to continue her denunciation of the police's violence, but it was also partially obscured by the use of her dark sunglasses. So in the wider chapter that I draw this from, I use this embodied effort by Bradford to stand defiantly before the photographer while also shading herself from direct view to justify the darkening out of names, to obscure the biographical information used within this archive. This act is critically different from, if on its surface, the same as redaction, one of the state's primary tools to hold up a putative freedom of information while also obscuring its own subversion and violent repression. The darkening out helps to form a visual poetics in the wider chapter that you probably already wanted to know who was the person that jumped in the fight, right? And it probably will, that might get on your nerves as we move forward and I obscure biographical information, but I'm following Bradford's lead here, to draw out the kind of defiant spatial acts that constituted the riot and that precipitated this archive of police records, but while parting with the fantasy of full knowability and intelligibility. And this, I'm not trying to reduce the rioters here to pure action, but I think it helps, using the dark and out helps to paint a portrait of collective spatial dynamics of everyday resistance in a context of unilateral power heightened by Cold War era urban emergencies. And my hope is that by obscuring some of that, we can get to some of the kind of collective spatial politics that are embedded within the riot, so-called riot. So as the police arrested Bradford, and the other unnamed man who I mentioned before, to put them in a police wagon, a crowd began to form, right? And from the rooftops of several three-story houses nearby came a barrage of bricks and bottles, which destroyed the windshields of the police, as well as cars, nearly a dozen other cars that were parked near the intersection. What's critical for me is that what that even begins to bring into view is the way that Black communities are creating livability and living spaces already that precede the incursion of police, riot police, that are then activated and weaponized in strategic ways against police, right? People didn't take bottles in the midst of a riot. They didn't find glass bottles, take them to the roofs and then throw them down. That indexes a social world, a rich social world, on top of the kind of overstacked geographies of Philadelphia's, subdivided row houses, right? And these kind of Black geographies, they're in excess. And what we could see through the riot is that there are Black geographies that exceed the flattening of the two kind of power-laden views that normally Black urban communities in this period come to be viewed through. Both the power-laden bird's eye view that reduces these neighborhoods to slums and sites of death and dying, and also the beat patrolmen, the kind of pedestrian formation of police, and including social workers and others that can only view, again, these communities as dying, debilitated, and not having any kind of meaningful trajectories within questions of the urban future. And so when this pops off and Black communities start to, around Columbia Avenue, weaponize against the mushroom of police that James Tate, then mayor of Philly, sends in based on a tactical plan from '63, it only angers people. They expect that they're going to send in police, lots of riot police, and that residents will just go back in their homes. People were not having it. That only incensed or incinerated the kind of moment. And at a certain moment during the so-called riot, a rumor began to spread, right? That a pregnant Black woman had been murdered had been beaten to death by police, right? Now, in the larger work, I explore why a riot and why rumor is important as a significant kind of site of urban information and knowledge based on Kwame Holmes and other folks' work. I don't have time to go through all of that, but we could talk about it perhaps during Q&A. But what really interests me and what I really want to talk to you mostly about is the ways that a kind of Black vernacular landscape is brought into view during the riot and what we can think about in relation to urban futures out of that. The riot brings into focus the terrain charted in the aspirations of the city pledged in the dark agoras, which I write about. Through those alternative spatial lexicons of Black social existence that tread within the territory of the illegible, there are novel forms of sovereignty that emerge to express a fleeting world of capital's disbandment, the appropriation of urban architectures and infrastructures. Not here the kind of just brick and mortar, but also the underlying spatial relations and disavowals of connection. That's what I mean by infrastructures, appropriating those for the full expression of Black social life, as opposed to the logics of flow, extraction, and legibility embedded by dominant urbanists in, everyday infrastructures like sidewalks, streets, row houses, that are designed to regulate urban sociality, taming desire, steadying market demands, and ensuring access by police, right? There's another set of uses that are already in play, and that are already appropriate in these infrastructures for the kind of features of Black life. And we see that really pointed with Bradford, right? She says, this street right here, this corner, I'm not moving. so there, at the top, we see a competing demand. I want to note a riot is not a general strike. It's not the culminating power of organized labor in relation to capital. In this case, it's not an expression manifesting in a treaty surveying and condemning the means of ownership, exclusion, and privilege. Rather, the mass actions of a riot represent a series of evasive formulations of resistance and refusal on the part of those condemned to a sequestered urban neighborhood that form a collective arsenal, a repertoire of tentative criticisms and disruptions that furtively interrupt the processes of enclosure, violent deprivation, deadly austerity, and the state's ultimate reinforcement of these through the use of police to arbitrate the relations of domination engendered by racial capitalism. It is an expression in this context of what even traditional Marxists deride as part of the redundant classes, the lumpen, the urban descendants of displaced peasants that take it upon themselves to rewrite the means of the city from below. It's not pure, it's rather anarchic in the sense of unwriting relations rather than the establishment of a new kind of order, domineering order. And I think it's complicated, and I want to hold out that the preponderance of rape case files within this archive make it really clear that these heated expressions of the urban future are not without sometimes the reproduction of gender and sexual domination and other forms of violence. And yet with these complexities in mind, and not to just pause them and put them to the side, the excess capacity of Black geographies to render in real time new dimensions suggests an underlying philosophy of space, one engaged in both the practical work of transforming urban geographies of sequestration, alienation, and atomization into spaces of Black vitality. For me, this originates in the kind of longer tradition of a Black counter movement against enclosure, violence, slavery, and the spatial and temporal regulation born in plantation ecologies that I draw on in the larger project, Sylvia Winter, and describing through the rubric of plotting. So in the original context, in my thinking, the plot describes Black communities' engagements with practices of place and alternative figurations of land and water in the antebellum and post-emancipation periods. Specifically, I'm located in the lower Chesapeake, but there are all kinds of resonances with the Deep South and the Caribbean and other places. And obviously Winter is a Caribbean thinker. So this is diasporic. I historicize the work of enslaved, free, and emancipated communities to create a distinctive and often furtive social architecture, rivaling, threatening, and challenging the infrastructures of abstraction, commodification, and social control developed by white elites before and after the formal abolition of slavery. Practices centered in the various iterations of the plot. Here for me, the site of the body's interment, the garden parcel, and hidden insurrectionary activity in one continuum, fostered a vision of decommodified water and landscapes as well as resources that evolved in dialectic with mastery and dominion, or biblically justified total control. And enslaved and post-emancipation Black communities claimed and created through this action, the actions of plotting and these sites, a set of communal resources within the interstices of plantation ecologies, constituting a Black commons. So I'm careful with the time, so I'm just gonna skip certain parts around the plot, but we can talk about it in Q&A, the larger kind of formation of the plot in history. But the plot in the Black Commons served as an enduring aspect of the symbolic universe of Black collective expression after the Civil War and Reconstruction. Critically, the Black Commons is almost nearly destroyed during the Civil Wars. Rivers and other kinds of spaces are weaponized. The interstices between plantations become even more dangerous. So plotting, I'm not suggesting a kind of straightforward adaptation of this outlook from slavery across the kind of violence of the Civil War and Reconstruction and post-Reconstruction. Nevertheless, in the ephemera of post-emancipation Black cultural life and work songs and sermons and religious ritual, equally as well within the carnal pursuits of sex, gambling, and drinking against which the saints had set themselves, it was a cultural raw material. Plotting in the Black Commons were the cultural raw material for visions grounding individual and collective futures outside the confines of slavery specters. And very quickly, we could think about like two very different kinds of texts from the interwar period. Lucille Bogan, Till the Cows Come Home, right? It's a very, what we might consider a very straightforward claim around erotic sovereignty that suggests all of her kind of all of her kind of sexual sovereignty, and bases that in Baltimore. But the refrain of the song is still this kind of rural imaginary associated with the plot. It's called Till the Cows Come Home, right? Even the temporality of her kind of sexual liberation is marked by that. And equally, probably as far away from that in some ways as we can think, we have Charles Tinley, who's who wrote We Shall Overcome in the early 20th century, but who's also, uses the plot as a kind of grammar of the plot in his sermons to also think about, to inhabit the church, right? So the plot imaginary has a wide and ranging opening through urbanization. So getting back to the riot, during the riot, these formations of plotting in the Black Commons reemerged as full-on revolt. The fleeting cessation of the relations of property and ownership, violence and exclusion that were governing city life. The Commons was expressed most poignantly in stealing and alternative demands on the nature of proximity and use of to collective authority to remain present despite mayoral order and violent police enforcement. What was labeled as looting collectively suggested the direct assault on ownership, the reappropriation of commodities as resources for personal and collective use, and a fleeting injunction against the sacrosanct relations of ownership, commodities, markets, and profits. The circulation of contraband food, liquor, clothing, and other resources that are brought into police records, that are documented there, show a glimpse of the intersection between Philly's underground, its kind of set apart, and the kind of wider ecology of Black vitality and sociality. In particular, I'm interested in food and what it can say not only about enduring hunger. Let's be clear, when Philly PPD pull people over or stop them with having too much food, there's a calculation about Black starvation inherent within that, right? They knew that a certain amount of food meant that you had looted because they didn't expect that Black communities should have access to that much food. Police entered, there's a whole form of collectivity that's found within that. In the records, you see people who live on the same block with the same last name who are caught at different parts of the city stealing different food items that, while I don't want to overread it, you might see as a collective meal, right? There's a feast in preparation here. Police entered one family home and found an excess of food, mattresses for 2 small children, and other stuff they consider contraband, either because they determined the residents couldn't afford them, and we could talk about what that means, or they look too pristine within their current environment to have been there before the beginning of the looting. What does that mean about how the kind of calculations around Black living and death that police move through with this kind of pedestrian view of the city that I discussed before? Looting, despite violent reinscriptions by the state in this context, names a means of expressing Black futurity from the vantage of what Joy James calls Black captive maternals. It signifies the appropriation of the means of care in a neighborhood defined by herbicide, joblessness, and hunger to establish the means of a new urban horizon. Claiming beyond the kind of stealing, claiming space out on one's stoop, on the sidewalk, on a street adjoining your residence. The police could only register this as refusing to obey the injunction against congregation. However, this suggests the ongoing ways in which Black vernacular landscapes make a different kind of claim on urban infrastructures. One's not guaranteed by the law in any meaningful way, but worked out in the quotidian appropriation of these spaces beyond the row house or the apartment as part of the functional geography of use through that a claim to sovereignty in relation to that geography outside of state regulation, right? So when officers arrest people for standing outside of on their stoops, and they say this belongs to me, right? This is my stoop, or I'm at the corner, they're being arrested on the corner. They say I live on this block. They refuse the idea that police have the power to regulate where they're able to go, even in this kind of moment of riotousness. And they make a claim that renters don't often get heard on, right? Saying like, this is ours. This is a kind of collective space. And I think in many ways, that's an ongoing everyday quotidian relationship in urban spaces in Philadelphia. That's often what's at stakes through gentrification. I mean, I've encountered now twice these weaponized sound makers through in North Philly around Temple, ordinary residents who have come and flipped properties, actually literally using weaponized sound to get people and their dogs to avoid certain blocks. This is so these kinds of claims to a larger geography weren't guaranteed and aren't guaranteed, and yet they need to be understood for how we think and make the city more livable. Given the ways that many of the residents, again, were renters, their living spaces, these claims suggest competing visions of territoriality, control, and power in the urban landscape, staged from those with very little legal protection in a city that regularly allow Black people to die in their own housing by fire, collapse, et cetera, as Marcus Hunter's pointed out. And I want to make a little moment to say why, to highlight the stoop as a really important site. In the larger work, I think about it as a translocation. Yes, a space regulating the inside and outside of domestic interior and exterior, but also as a site of transformation and transfiguration, often for Black communities and in Black geographies, where multiple worlds become one. Translocations for me in this describe the materialization in the form of the residual of the physical, social, and metaphysical registers of one place into another, and how those kind of bleed together. And for me, the riot is a register of the ways that plotting in the Black Commons continues to resonate in Black life up through Black power. So Black migrants recombine the logics, outlooks, and modes of placemaking, riffing on this larger imagery and imaginary of the plot in their visions of personal and erotic sovereignty, earthly transformation, metaphysical reordering, in the new confines of herbicide. And I think I'll point to Mrs. W, this woman interviewed by a Black social scientist, Arthur Huff Fawcett, in the 1940s for his classic religion text, Black Gods of the Metropolis. This is from the kind of notes that he presented there. Mrs. W, a migrant from Virginia, when asked about her religious experiences and her desire to become one of the saints, she recalls this experience where she stepped out on her stoop and these men were gambling and using vulgar language, right? In that moment, and how she remembers as a kind of key technology of memory around how she came to holiness, she's transported to a space above the city in which she sees the urban slum, quote unquote, dissipate into a field. Again, this plot imaginary doesn't go away, right? It continues to manifest as a vision for how people orient themselves, but also it gives us a sense of how this excessiveness of Black urban geographies, where it comes from, right? It's not just a conditioning of isolation, of economic deprivation. It's also the kind of enduring legacies of Black ingenuity around land and waterscapes to create livable, inhabitable space within the uninhabitable. And I want to say, I don't think it's always good to measure and map these kinds of relations. And that's why I'm very careful about it in the larger work, because I know that these kinds of maps can serve the ways for lots of new infrastructures, especially in Philadelphia, that emphasize livability and exclude lots of working class Black people, right? So quintessentially in Philly, the neoliberal infrastructure extraordinaire is the bike path greenway that they built along the Schuylkill River. And so what I'm trying to get at here is that in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s and 90s was a space for Black and Black queer congregation, right? Lamented, criminalized, often violently removed. The right-of-way land for railroad is now been turned into a walking path. And that's, we could talk about the kinds of formations of monopoly capital and real estate investment trusts that are there, that have encouraged policing and incarceration, while also taking the formations and the spaces and infrastructures of Black livability and making them exclusive, right? It's not like, what I'm trying to get at there is like the bike path already found life, right? It found somewhere where there was already life. It didn't create life. So these kind of maps about livability they're high stakes, because I think the new regime of profitability in cities really does seek to police, again, colonize Black knowledge about how to live in the deindustrialized post-industrial world, and then also removing those same people. So this claim by rioters in relation to space in front of one's rented apartment in a subdivided row house is not, of course, recognized by the law. In the face of the law's enforcers, these communities claim the steps and the sidewalks and the stoops as a part of the territory over which they could argue for propriety, but which in the legal climate of a mayoral order registers only as, again, as obstinacy. The efforts to extend claims to the dimensions of the geography of vitality, to the stoop and the sidewalk and the corner, again, indexes the ongoing alternative system of value, the enduring legacy of the Black commons, as a complex competing ethos of sovereignty, ownership, and connection through utility and possibility over profitability, regulation, violence, and order. I think I want to end with this. The riot for me also brings into focus the kinetics of late 20th century Black politics. So although civil rights leadership condemned the actions as inane violence, they gained political leverage through its deployment. And this is not meant as critique. I think people are operating in the kinds of problem spaces in which they were operating. They're trying to respond to multiple forces at once. But figures like Cecil Moore, for whom Columbia Avenue is now named, where the riot happened, they weren't the source of the transformation, rather they were its beneficiaries. Their charisma, their public political power was the materialization of a bottom-up push for the end of property. So what's at stake? I think we see the source of Black power in enduring ways, and we've seen it for this last summer and going into now, as originated in competing worlds that are the kind of afterlives of the plot that they that gives expression to. In the heated eruption, for example, of the riot, this is in the heated example of the riot, we can see that these kinds of bottom-up expressions. I want to stop there, and because I'm careful that we're approaching time, but I hope that you can see the ways in which this cessation around extraction and Black condemnation to living in spaces of unlivability that we get a glimpse of in the kinds of care that's extended through quote unquote what's stolen, but also these claims to the neighborhood, the stoop, that extend beyond ownership and property, that those are blueprints for a more livable city for all. And we could talk more about those connections if you like now.
I just was going to say, please be sure to raise your hand or post in the chat. I see Max, you have a a physical hand raised, so you'll get the first question.
Well, thank you.
Thank you, JT.
Okay, so I'm a little curious. I am an urban sociologist and I'm very much into urban planning. And I am curious about your characterization of the walking and the bike path over the Schuylkill as being a neoliberal project. And I don't know as much as I should perhaps about that area, but you had mentioned that was an area where queer folk had gathered, and that the building of this bike path is, I don't mean to put words in your mouth, but it sounded like you were describing it as somewhat oppressive, as opposed to an indication of good urban planning, which connects neighborhoods via walking and bike paths and repurposes rail trails for a common collective purpose. So I am curious about that.
Thank you. That's a great question. I think, these used to be spaces of often abject and dejected communities, drug users, homeless people, queer folks, Black folks in general, seen as involved in illicit activity, etc. The issue is not the kind of baseline aspects of the infrastructure. Of course, those kinds of infrastructures of livability are critical for how we might make cities livable, and also how we can create and integrate green into our architectures. The problem is the formation of governance that came to build that. So that particular one is headed by, and a series of parks in Philadelphia that have been semi-privatized are headed by the president of a real estate investment trust, who's Brandywine Trust, which in 1995 had $5 million, and in 2005 had $5 billion, and owned multiple property, hundreds of thousands of square feet of property from Philadelphia to Houston. Now all of that money, real estate investment trusts are our collective wealth at the end of the day, right? Real estate investment trusts, if you're paying into insurance funds, if you use Cash App, these kind of fleeting moments of money are being passed through those kinds of structures, meaning that we all have if you got a TIAA, you probably invested in a real estate investment trust. It's all of our money, right? There is, on the other hand, however, no democracy around how that money is allocated, right? And so when we talk about a real estate investment trust owner being the president of privatized parks in Philadelphia that have their own private security forces, we're not talking about a livable city for all. We're talking about urban infrastructures that have been in place in a way that that displaced Black communities. And as soon as the Schuylkill River Park opened, there were accusations of Black youth harassing white people. And they've been subsequently in the years since have been policed out. So I'm here for all kinds of these kinds of livable architectures and green infrastructures when they do not displace Black people and other urban working class and non-working class communities. So that's the I think we have to get to a vision of urban planning that does not hold on to the idea that even where we see abject life, that's a space of death and dying. We should rather see where certain kinds of collectivities are formed as actually the elementary, like how to live in unlivable space, and to work with communities to enhance that rather than to displace.
Thank you.
Thank you, Max. We have a question in the chat from Eddie who says, wow, that was powerful. Could you talk about the stops as translocation as a gendered space?
Definitely. I mean, thank you. The stoop is definitely a gender geography, right? When Mrs. W exits in her vision, in her memory of her vision that prompts her to turn to holiness and to set apart. And I want to suggest that the set apart and the gamblers aren't that far apart. First of all, they're interdependent formations and congregations, right? If you go to some of the set apart congregations that I look at in my work, their first prohibition is gambling, right? And drinking. They're literally formations of people who were formerly in the underground or who have some connection with it. And but the stoop is it's a gendered site in multiple ways. I mean, we know that it's a site of potential injury and harm and kind of adverse relationships, gender relationships that involve sexual violence, like regulating the stoop. But I think also it's this point where we see, and in Mrs. W's articulation of it, we can also, where she's prompted to have this vision when she encounters the gambling men. There's also the formation of the kind of territory around around the Black commons and Black grounds in the context of slavery and post-emancipation that plays forward, right? It's a kind of, it doesn't so which that is I mean, I can pull up my slides to show you a little bit about that. Give me a second. But we could see, I wanted to say more about the plotting, but we could see in the kind of original context of my articulation, the plot is expressed in the interstices of these geographies that are otherwise processional geographies of power, right? You're supposed to approach, if you see on the left, the big house mapped out with slave cabins and other outer buildings, someone's supposed to drive up in a carriage and see this big house and be impressed by the power. And if you look at, as Tiffany Lethabo King and others have done, maps of U.S. Colonial presence and settler conquistador relationships, they just show contiguous maps of plantations. Now we know from lots of history around, from WPA narratives to the historiography, that Black communities inhabit and mobilize those kinds of geographies, which includes the kind of predecessor of the plot and the porch, right? We also know that the porch is a Black geography inherited, a Black architectural feature inherited through the Haitian Revolution through New Orleans, right? So even even the kind of idea of the porch comes through the African diaspora. And so that kind of use of outside, it's gendered, but in a very complex formation, right? It's part of this exterior world where enslaved peoples, in the context of slavery, use the woods, the little areas around their house, subfloor pits, Harriet Jacobs classically, the interiors of their ceilings, hidden spaces within plantation ecologies to create the possibilities for their own worlds. Elizabeth Sparks said in a WPA interview, sometimes they beat some of the slaves so bad that they run away to the woods. But if you get in the woods, they could get you. They couldn't get you. You could hide and people would slip you something to eat. That relationship, right, of slipping you something to eat, there's a kind of excessive formation around plotting and land that happens through use value and community formation that is extended to the urban futures, and it's glimpsed in those moments where people, like, for example, have visions around their stoop. Okay.
Okay. So, additional questions. I have a perhaps not so much of a question. Thank you, Eddie, for that question. Not so much of a question, but a kind of, I don't know, something I'm thinking about. And it's the first slide you showed, which was of Mrs. Odessa Bradford in the shades. And I just immediately, of course, thought of like throwing shade, right? But you talk about this as a kind of a redaction, right? And it's an embodied redaction. And I'm wondering if you can say a little bit more about how you see that occurring in the context of perhaps sort of contemporary evocations in terms of how, urban folks who dwell in urban sites, Black people, people of color, working class folks participate in a kind of redaction in the context of perhaps gentrification or some such other kinds of forces. I'm also thinking about things like the poor doors, right? In sort of these mixed use buildings. So not a fully formed question, but just sort of things I'm thinking about.
I think it's something we definitely have to continue to be very flexible about, especially in the modes of organizing and activism that center like street politics and direct confrontation. Let's be serious. We're in a moment where Google, Amazon, and these other technologies are cooperating with authorities to create facial recognition technologies and all of that. Now, I've seen some Black artists who have been working with like stuff that disrupts that, but we already know that the face, all of the, I mean, the I'm thinking about Ruha Benjamin's work. I mean, like literally the hand sanitizers don't work for Black people. So are we supposed to expect that the facial recognition is going to be accurate? It's not, right? And so I think we're in a very practical sense of like urban moments of revolt, which I think, I drew back to this talk because the Chauvin trial, if we expecting justice, even if there is a conviction, if we're expecting justice, we can't bring Floyd back, right? We can't bring Wright back. And I think that we're in a moment where these kinds of things are really, really significant in the very practical mode of how do we do this kinds of work in our evolving surveillance society, right? And I think Simone Brown's work with Dark Surveillance, I don't speak French. So. I think so I'm just gonna say, Black counter surveillance technologies and techniques and artistry is really significant and important in that context. I think as well in a quotidian way, we have to think about how to, I think this also goes for our social media profiles and all of that, right? Just very practically. Maybe I shouldn't get into all of that, but we need to be much more strategic about how we are organizing. That's part of it where I think that's important. She confronted power, right? She said directly in her interview with the Tribune, she said it was the police's fault. The Tribune interviewers tried to ask Odessa Bradford what had happened between her and her husband. She said it's none of your business, right? So her redaction is embodied, it's discursive, it's like, that's not the matter. What is the matter is when they try to drag me out of the car. And she says explicitly in the interview, none of the rioting would have happened if they hadn't tried to drag me out, right? And forcibly pull me out of the car. So I think we have to think about what that all means forward. Again, in our technology, let's be serious. Some of the people who have recorded police killings have mysteriously died, are awaiting, or have been incarcerated, while the people who did it ain't in jail, right? We have to draw on these kinds of histories of redaction to confront that moment.
Yeah, thank you. And what I love about this too is that it's such a break from this idea of dissembling, right, which is a kind of performance, to redaction, which seems to me a refusal, right? It's a complete sort of like blackening, that you don't even get to enter the space to ask the question that would sort of, elicit something, right? It's just a complete refusal. So yeah, I was really struck by that.
Can I say something else? I would say, part of it is like the state already has these records. They're already there. They're in for public view, right? So the act, as much as I'm doing it, it doesn't protect or incubate.
Right. Yeah.
People have already been arrested. It's been processed. Yeah. But there is something about, there's something that happens visually with the opacity of the black markouts in that that refuses, again, the simple falling into biography, right? A simple falling into, well, these were just some Black kids, robber, whatever. You have to deal with what they were doing and what they were engaging in a very different way. So thank you for that question. It's something that I'm continuing to think through.
Great. So we have one more question from Jeff Dess, virtual and real hand raised.
Yeah, sorry. I just wanted to say thank you again for such important conversation, because there's so many things that you don't even realize until you really impacted it. So thank you so much, Doc. And I just wanted to say, on a college campus, also, many of us that are working on college campuses, also looking at these spaces and how they're impacting students of color as well, from student activists. And many campuses have like administrative buildings that students don't necessarily always feel comfortable going into, separation in a way that some residence halls are developed and things of that nature. So, I guess my question is like maybe some feedback you might have for those of us who are working on college campuses or with students on being able to be more aware of maybe some of those spaces that we're occupying, that we are, because I just love to not be oblivious and be a part of creating more of these issues that might be happening. So I don't know if you have any insight regarding that.
I think we have to create, I think infrastructures and architectures at universities and other, and this isn't, you know, a particular hack at any university, but I've been in a lot of spaces that have really intense relationships internally and externally, right, with community, and internally within the communities, right. I've always found that it was really critical, and this is actually where I met Dr. Donaldson, is like, you know, in the kind of fleeting passages between those kinds of infrastructures and architectures. And I think that's part of the lesson here, from the fact that the weaponization during this kind of, you know, moment of the riot suggests all these other possibilities for that space that preceded the riot, right? People didn't riot like, first of all, they threw stuff from places where they were already congregating to make livable lives. And I think that's the kind of work that I don't think that we should view, and maybe this is too frank, but the architectures and infrastructures out of certain kinds of fleeting passages of connection as infrastructures that are designed for our freedom, full education, and liberation, because they're not. But at the same time, that's not to say to abandon them. Again, I'll invoke Ruthie Gilmore in that essay about the nonprofit industrial complex, having a foot in and a foot out. And I think that's, you know, I think that's also about the modalities that we take up in those spaces, right? Like sometimes it's hard to, when you're overworked and sometimes underpaid, to do everything that you're supposed to do. But do you privilege students, or do you privilege institutionality? And it becomes hard, because sometimes that means your job or not. But I think those are the kinds of lessons that we can learn from this spatial politics, is to privilege those fleeting relationships at the edges of institutional space as the possibilities for what those universes and universities and worlds could be.
Thank you for that, Jeff. Thank you also for that question. That's a great question. One of the things that I learned kind of coming up was that a lot of public education spaces are also built by the same people who build prisons. So if we want to look at sort of the structure of our public institutions, not all, but right, a lot of the same sort of kind of the same similar impetus that goes into building prison spaces, right, goes into building public educational institutions as well, right? Very much the panopticon, for example, right? But if there are no more questions, if there's a last question that's burning and you want to ask, if not, then please join me in thanking Dr. Roane for taking the time to come talk with us today. This is an amazing conversation, and I hope that it continues here and beyond. And thank you so much. I'm just I'm filled right now. I was telling JT earlier that I needed music this morning because things were so heavy. And so I'd been listening to Bob Marley's Concrete Jungle. And so thank you for this really rich conversation, for this wonderful workshop that is so generative in many ways. And I just want to add one last thing, which is that the Hagan Center will continue these conversations, and we formed a Black Ecologies working group as part of being in conversation with folks like JT and his institution and other institutions around the country who are beginning to, or have been doing the work of sort of race, going through and thinking, deeply about these intersections of race, class, gender, environment, space, and all of the other sort of ways that we inhabit, right, urban sites. So thank you, JT, for opening up our conversation here. And thank you everyone for coming. I'm really just sort of heartened to see all of your lovely faces and names across the screen. And there will be more conversation. So also give yourselves a round of applause for being just committed to being part of this community. Thank you. And this video will be up shortly, we hope. So be soon. So thank you all for coming.
Thank you so much.
Have a great one.
Yeah.